Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for coming in today. So the talk you just heard about API governance is something very interesting. And today, I wanted to talk to you about what it means to have the right API design principle and also the integration topologies and how it is key to unlocking value in some of our customers that we work on a day-to-day. And more specifically, because this conference is all about focusing from a financial services perspective, I thought let me bring that as a flavor. So introducing myself, I'm Ajay. I have a fairly long name, so probably you can call me Ajay. I come from India, so we do have a fairly long name. But I represent Salesforce, MuleSoft as a brand today, and I head up the solutions engineering team for one of the industry verticals, which is a services industry. And today I wanted to tie back into some of the things that we are doing with our customers and the wider ecosystem as well, so that we can actually narrate it back to you. So thank you. So before we actually get into the weeds of it, what's happening really today is every business is being challenged. And in the way that challenge is good, because it's actually pushing these businesses and in turn our customers and in turn us as companies trying to sell software into these businesses as well, because not only they are looking at new models to innovate, but also we are being looked at what are those uncertainties that might come up in the market. And how do we really tackle or be ready for that change? Because there are new products that needs to be launched, there are new markets that needs to be get into, but there are also expectations that are changing. And the uncertainty always looms on top of what is next, because that's something that we weren't prepared for with the pandemic, and we had to pivot. So with that being said, the things that are really impacting financial services industry, and these are some of the top 3 things that I can actually recall. The expectations are changing. Customers really today need faster onboarding times. They no longer want to wait. The Gen Z or the millennial generation really wants everything at the snap of a finger. The margins are really compressing. For a brand, be it banking, insurance, their operating margins are compressing, so they need to really think of innovating at scale. And data is becoming increasingly critical. So data is actually scattered over multiple systems. So how do you make sense of that is also a critical question. And with that, I think it all ties back into what we can do to move forward with the next set of action. So if I were to divide these 2 buckets, right, like the company or the brand itself and then the consumer on the other side, all the things that the company is trying to do with the consumers in the financial industry space is like, we want to understand our customers better. We want to build a 360 profile around them. We want to be able to pinpoint and sell them products that they think they will need in the future and build it accordingly and personalize it at scale as well. So while all of this is being considered, there's also opportunities to bring in new perspective. And while all of this is being considered, there are a lot of these challenges that keep coming in, and these are really the roadblockers. What I would like to probably see them as the ones that are typically looming in within the company's infrastructure. You could call them as legacy stuff. Data is not very well connected. We've seen all of this happening before. And also, with a lot of regulatory requirements need to be followed, there are more stringent requirements to be building that way at scale. And then you'll also have to keep innovating about what is the new organizational model to look at the business. And with these challenges in mind, one of the things that is very fundamental here is speed is never equal to agility. And why is that so? Because this is where we'll try to get to towards the end of the session is what is that right equation? What is that right principle that any developer, architect, or a CIO needs to have in mind while they're trying to move forward in the next one? The faster implementation cycles are really good. If you can really roll out quickly to the market, it's really great. But then you go through a lot of service sprawl. So what service sprawl here really means is you'll start doing multiple things at the same time. You'll have multiple silos of data created in that way. And what that leads to is really low maintainability and increasing the complexity. Further down the line, you'll also run into a lot of technical debt, because if you run into a problem, you'll spend a lot of time troubleshooting that, and over a period of time, you'll lose governance and security. So we just heard about great principles of governance. And where this all ties back into is agility going lower. So this is one of those longer-term plans or the equations that every CIO needs to think of. Now let's look at what have been the brands doing. Like everybody started somewhere with a monolith in mind. Like they wanted to build something that is very robust. But as times keep changing and as new technologies have been adventing, we've been adding a lot of new stuff. We've been going microservice driven, we have gone evented architecture, we've gone hyperscalar, but then trying to match it up with the speed of the change in the market, with the control that you can always bring back to these projects, there's always been a gap. And this is the gap that every company is trying to solve, the gap between IT and the gap between business. And this is the one that technology alone cannot solve the problem. That is the foundation here. So if you were to move forward, and we just heard about composability as a key principle. So composability is, if not today, in the future, every company will have it on their business mandate. How can we be more composable? It's not just about the technical landscape, but it's also about making the whole business composable. And that is exactly what I'm here to talk to you today about. So this is the equation that you'll probably hear from me. Composable enterprise, if we were to put a math equation behind it, what does it really map to? Great set of APIs. We'll see what those great APIs really look like. Is there an API marketplace that a brand is thinking? Also, is there an observable application network? When all these applications start talking to each other, do you have a metric that bounds all of this? And then do you have an automation overview around this? So while these are deep topics in itself, I am here to talk to you today about one of it, which is around great APIs, because they are in separate conversations, each topic of its own. So if we were to put a lens on top of this composable enterprise, what we talked just now is the great API set, and what we really need to pivot to is taking a look at API as a product. What this means is you'll start dissecting an API or start building an API as if it were having finer grained controls of logic, business connectivity, and governance built into the API itself, rather than having to see it as an overarching principle. And with this, the question arises, if API is the answer, what's the right way to do it? So we went back as a company, and we did some research, talking to developers, ecosystem architects, integration developers, and wider DevOps and cloud engineers as well. What does a good and great API design looks like? So we bucketed this across 4 categories, and I would like to thank my research team from the company who was actually able to provide some of this in a more consolidated way. So we heard what APIs look like and what the great API looks like. So there are certain parameters around being performant, being enduring, and compliant with the standards, and also being resource efficient. We'll see some of this in principle moving forward. But the motivation for great API always comes from, is it shared? Is it productive for the need that you're building it for? Is there a cultural activity around it in terms of organizations could build structures differently compared to other organizations, and that actually talks about their maturity cycle. And also, developers always keep complaining that I don't have enough time to build a great API, so I am going to get this done in this project, and that's all it takes. But what is prioritized when building an API? It's the functional requirements, it's those performance standards, and also the security. So we'll speak about security down the line, but all of this results in reusability. That's another important pillar. Am I building structures that are going to be reusable across the organizations for other projects? Does this save a lot of time for the future projects? And can there be standardizations that we can drive? So we started comparing what is good versus good enough, and there were some stats that we arrived at. You'll all get access to these slides, but really it was fundamental for us to see this survey being done across developers around the globe, and we could actually see the result is not very different. So where I come from, my origins from India, we have a lot of strong developer ecosystem as a base. But if you move away from that market into the more modern market or the North American market, the developer ecosystem has always been to be more agile, more new age cloud architecture agnostic, but you'll see these principles not changing or diversing very much. So having said this, let's take a look at what makes an API design bad, because that's another key principle that we have to address. And speaking again with developers and architects, the first thing that came out was poor performance. My API doesn't have a good error handling rate. it has a frequency to break down occasionally. So I have to spend a lot of time troubleshooting it rather than using it. Not good. Non-compliant. I'm not built it for the market regulatory standards. Everything that's changing month on month, year on year, we have to keep up with pace, but we were not thinking long term, so not a compliant API, which means your customers are not going to use it, which means your product is not going to be usable down the line. The last one, really the most important one, poor documentation. Because it's one thing to build amazing APIs, but another thing to not have any documentation around it. Because sometimes you'll be amazed to see more than the developers, the non-developers are the ones who actually spend time to go and read the API documentation. And when they do that, the business users, they actually find it very hard to understand why was this actually even built in the first place. And if this is so poorly documented, how am I going to train my new engineers and architects who are going to join the company? So these are the 3 parameters that stood out. So let me tell you a story. This is a story about a persona. Let's call her Laura. Laura is everybody in the room, a new age millennial who has been trying to onboard a new product from a bank or an institute. And Laura has been trying to identify what's her saving balance. And she finds it increasingly hard to actually get to a point where she can get to a total balance. What is my total savings with this bank or set of financial products that I have? Because her bank sells her multiple products, and she has to now go into multiple places to look for that information. But that's not the only problem. Let's pivot and move into the bank itself. So Nathan, who is a relationship manager or a financial advisor, he has a similar problem. He complains that he has to switch at least 7 to 8 screens before he can make a recommendation to a customer like Laura. And it is frustrating for him to do his day-to-day job. So the biggest problem here that you see is the swivel chair, be it a customer, be it the brand itself. And they're not able to drive a logistical next best action. So if we were to pivot this and put it on a whiteboard, and sorry, we don't have a whiteboard, so I sort of drew a swivel diagram, and we try to connect all these systems together, you'll start seeing a spaghetti code forming over a period of time. Things will start mumbling and cropping up on top of each other. So we just picked a handful of systems. So what this really means is these systems are going to be brittle, not adaptable, not ready for change. And switching of context for a customer is the biggest drainer. So that's an attrition risk that you have. And coupling these systems becomes increasingly harder as in when you keep adding more systems. So we tried to pivot this, and we switched back to a view, which is probably you've seen in the industry, called as an API-led view. And I'm going to take a back step to talk about how we did this using one of our products, MuleSoft. And what we did is we took a look at all the systems which were there in the banking ecosystem. And some of the key systems, we actually unlocked them using some of the out-of-the-box connectors, some of the standard interfaces that they exposed, and we put a layer of APIs, calling them as system layers, system APIs. Above this, we started building business process orchestration, which is where we tied back values into Customer 360. How can you generate a single view of a customer for a customer like Laura, and what it means for a branch manager like Nathan to be able to get that information quickly. And we tied back details like credit history, account opening details, any other future products potentially. And we tied that back into the experience channels, which is mostly the digital channels which customers like Laura or even a branch manager like Nathan was interacting. And we call them as experience APIs. So what this really meant for a brand, and we'll talk about some customer stories down the line, is we were able to decouple some of those systems which were operated and managed by a central IT. We gave business users action of defining the business processes, and we were able to give some of the experienced developers like mobile developers or web experience developers way to consume those services from down below. And all of this was really driving agility for a brand. Now that we've sort of taken a look, I want to talk to you about some of the integration patterns that we see. And these are some of the ones that I won't go into the depths of it today, but you've typically seen companies talking about these pillars across the brand. It could be data synchronization, it could be replication, virtualization, and even the enterprise-grade integration. But you actually see coupling being very tight from one type to becoming very loose as you move down the line. And today, what I want to talk to you about is some of the more detailed ones that we actually support today from a company standpoint, but we also see common of this occurring in customer scenarios. And it could be around your RPC, it could be around synchronization, it could be around virtualization, but there's a neat, clean way to do this, and that's what I'm here to talk about today. So if you were to look at this through an alternate lens, and this is probably what you'll see coming out of Gartner and other key research organizations, is that they bucketize this very differently. Can we do integration patterns as if it is a fully managed iPaaS? Can we do it as a fully managed API management solution? And you'll meet amazing brands today talking about that. Can we do data integration as an integration principle? And the last one is, can we do an intelligent robotic process automation? And while each of them have certain pivotal values that you'll be able to tie into, you'll need to think as a brand what makes sense to use and which ones to pick for the right use cases. And those are the really interesting questions. So we put together this integration pattern workflow, which I've seen working amazingly well when I go and talk to customers who are spread across hybrid cloud environments, working across distributed API designs. And what we've typically seen is for every project, there's always been a requirement to ingest data, always been a requirement to connect to another system. And depending on what systems you connect, you could branch out into these 3 or 4 categories. It could be around real time. Do I really need real time all the time? Maybe not, only a few times. Can there be asynchronous integration patterns that I might need? And within the asynchronous, can there be concepts around data consistency and concepts around data security as a requirement? And then there are these traditional batch processes, which run over nightly or weekly batch processes. And then there are these broadcast messaging, which are typically your decision trees that you need to decide based on which customer buys which product. And what you'll see across the industry today is when customers come to a design decision, they actually start looking at, for this particular project, can I choose this integration principle? But for another project, should I be able to use this same one that my team put in a lot of effort building? Or should I invest a new time engineering effort? So as an integration designer or integration architects today, one of the things that we need to focus on is how can you really talk about reuse every time? Because if you're not building it for reuse, you're not really building it for scale. That's the principle. So we wanted to take a lens on top of one of those real-time designs, and I've made it very, very generic. I have not tied it back to a product particularly that we sell. When you're trying to design a real-time API, and you're trying to make sense, because everybody is now very keen to do personalization at scale. I need to be able to send my customers messages now. I need to be able to get their data in real time, et cetera. So while thinking of all of this, there's a way and there are certain buckets of categories of architecture principles that you need to be focusing on. And these flow diagrams that we've built has come out of that kind of a research, where we have seen customers, absolutely, at least 70% of them flowing through this design flow, and it clearly gives them a branch metrics. And what this means is, if you see the last part of the lingo, where if they are doing something outside of the domain system, which is if they're not really doing a domain-driven design, then they'll actually end up coding it, hard coding it. They'll actually end up writing a lot of custom code for it, which is naturally what you have seen. But the question to ask again is this scalable? Is this reusable? And you've seen brands like Google, Facebook, doing this at scale, and the only reason they have been able to do this at scale is the engineering principles are so diversely tied back into what can be reused across the company. Harvard Business Review talked about this very interesting 3 data points. What do CIOs really care about? CIOs have been complaining that about their customer relevancy and experience being a big gap. Companies will build something, but their customers want completely opposite, and they only realize when the product goes live. And this has been a big gap. It's an ever-increasing gap. And the reason for it is because customers have a lot of choice and options available to them today. And the one thing that they're trying to do in this space is, can we build a single customer view? And if they're able to do this, can they act upon it almost all the time? So with that, I wanted to give you a principle of what that customer view looks like. And I was signaled for, we have only another 5 minutes, so I'll probably jump through a few things, which is around what really bridges that gap, which is the fragmentation within the landscape. How can you really help drive that space, but also can you evolve at speed? Because there are so many technical options available. So today what I wanted to give you two different perspectives. What did we do as a company, Salesforce and MuleSoft, in a banking scenario, and what did we do in an insurance scenario, as two examples. The first one was really helping one of our customers move away from a monolith data store to a more composable, reusable enterprise architecture, where we unlocked some of their source systems, we built business processes on top of it, and tied it back into an experience or consumable layer. And this was Co-op Bank. So most of you have seen what and who is Co-op Bank. They're an SME bank. They have over 86,000 customers here in the UKI. And they came to us with three problems. They said, we want to modernize our legacy data, we want to streamline customer onboarding, and we want to personalize our journeys while we do it. Customer onboarding for a bank like Co-op was taking about 5 to 10 days when a new customer reached out to them. And the challenge that they threw at us was, can you bring it to less than 24 hours? And we did. So the way we did it is we decomposed their architecture. We tied back some of their legacy systems, modernized it by putting an API layer on top of it, tied back their business processes into a customer onboarding process layer, and digitized the consumable layer on top. What that resulted is them increasing their market share. So they went from almost 70,000 customers to 86,000 customers in about a year's time. And they were able to onboard so many customers because of the agility and scale that we gave them. Next one, I want to talk to you about the insurance scenario. And this was a customer where we actually had a lot of legacy insurance systems, underwriting systems, policy admin systems tied into, and we were able to digitize that for them. And Guidewire was one of the key systems there, a heavy one. And they came up to us, Pacific Life, they came to us with an interesting proposition. I want to empower not just my bankers, but also the customers by giving them new interfaces to interact with, like Alexa, Google smartphones. And they wanted to expand their market share. So we were able to decouple some of their systems and tie back their underwriting and business processes into the process layer, and then tie it back into the more digitized layer of the modern systems. And thereby, we actually saw them creating about 22 APIs in less than 5 months with 4 developers in the company. And all of this was powered because we had reuse at every stage. So whatever they built in phase 1 got used all the way till phase 3 because they only had to create newer assets every time. So the last question I want to leave you is, how do you transform at scale? What are those 4 pillars for you to take away, which is around integration, API management, automation, and API ecosystem, which is the marketplace? Can you think of building composable building blocks around this? And if you're doing that, does it enhance your ability to not just connect with your customers, but also collaborate and have fine-grained control within your organization, but also do the right thing for the customer? And if you're doing that, you're actually building your business to be agile at scale. And while we are innovating this way, IT and business teams in the company, they're still at gap. There's always going to be a gap. But as developers, as IT architects, it's our responsibility to think of what is the right API strategy to move forward. Can we build the bridge to bring the gap closer and make it smaller? So with that, I want to leave you with a question to mull over in this amazing conference. How composable is your business? And with that, it's a wrap. Thank you.